Hello and welcome to the Everything Weather Podcast, where we talk with people about the weather world, explore and discuss everything weather, and have a little fun along the way. I'm your host, Kyle David, and this is the first episode of the podcast and the first episode of this big launch day that we've got going on for today. If you're listening to this on November 18th, 2024, I'll be introducing myself, talking a little bit about my background and experiences. Then I'll get into why I'm actually doing the podcast and talk about the structure and the schedule of the podcast. With that said, let's dive right in. So, for those that don't know me, I am a New Jersey-based meteorologist. I've been living here for pretty much my whole life, and people will say that I've been interested in the weather since I was a kid. My mom, on the other hand, will say that I've been interested in it ever since I was born. Me, on the other hand, I'll just say, I've been interested in it as far back as I can remember. And there were a lot of different things that fueled my interest and passion for the weather. One of those things was my mom. She was very curious about the weather and always interested. And I guess I kind of got that weather bug from her. So it's nice to share that, be able to share that passion for the weather with my mom. Some other things that really fueled my interest in the weather was the Weather Channel. I mean, again, my mom was always interested in the weather, and we always had the Weather Channel on in the house for the most part. So I grew up religiously watching the Weather Channel, and I watched people like Jim Cantori, Stephanie Abrams, Mike Betties share their passion for the weather and be excited about it. So I got to see these people be excited about something, and that made me want to learn more about it. And then from there were other events that, fueled my passion for the weather even more, particularly weather events. For me, it was the Boxing Day blizzard. I don't remember the specifics of it, but I remember after, like feet of snow in where I was living at the time in Somerset County. Hurricane Irene, even though it wasn't as impactful as Hurricane Sandy, which I remember a lot more. And with that particular storm, I remember the flooding in my community, the amount of damage there was. We were without power for several days, and at the time we had lizards and pets that needed heat, and it got very cold in the house, so we were without power for a couple of days, and that got me worried. And I also saw the pictures of the aftermath, particularly by my grandparents' house in LBI. They were fortunate enough to be spared from major damage, but seeing the aftermath, that gave me a different appreciation for the weather. I wanted, at that point, to help people navigate that and get them through those big weather events. And that is kind of in my nature, to help people. So with all of that, and then also I'll mention every meteorologist, weather enthusiast will mention the Twister movie as something that got them interested in the weather. For me, it was no exception. I grew up watching that as a kid. Probably shouldn't have, considering some of the language in there, but hey, that interested me. I didn't think at the time I wanted to storm chase, but it was interesting seeing tornadoes, severe weather in that kind of light. So naturally, that kind of just fueled my passion even more for the weather. So fast forward, I'm graduating from high school and I'm looking at colleges. I eventually ended up going to Rutgers University, just right down the road. And I studied meteorology there, and I got involved with the on-campus, on-air program called Weather Watcher, and that allowed me to do forecasts for the Rutgers community and the broader state of New Jersey. And I'll preface this by saying I hated public speaking, and I was almost deathly afraid of it. So you're probably wondering, why would you get involved with a on-air program like that? And because that's public speaking, and you're right. And at first, I was very uncomfortable with it, and you could probably find my first couple of clips, and I looked like a deer in headlights. But as I started doing it more, I found that I loved doing this. I loved talking about the weather, despite being afraid of public speaking, and I found that that got me past my fear of public speaking, and it made me a better communicator overall. And I also got involved with the student chapter of the American Meteorological Society, which is basically the nation's largest collection of weather professionals, enthusiasts, companies, and I got involved with that. And I found out how much you can do within meteorology, because it's not just broadcasting or the National Weather Service. There's a whole bunch of different things that you could do within meteorology. And I got to meet a lot of cool alumni as part of the student chapter of the American Meteorological Society. After that, I really just kept going with it. I got an internship with ABC 7 in New York, got to learn from Lee Goldberg, Jeff Smith, Brittany Bell, and I, at that point, wanted to go into broadcasting or some sort of weather communications. And I graduated, and I started out with a little, at the time, little company, but rapidly growing company called Fox Weather. Right out of college, got to do stuff from home. I worked on weather graphics, telling the weather story in a visual lens. And then I eventually got promoted to a full-time position with them, got to go into the city every day, 5 days a week. And I helped develop a new show format from there and got to tell the weather story and show the weather story in a whole bunch of new ways that were not familiar with me at the time. And I liked it. This was fresh, new experiences for me. And it was fun. It was very unique. But I knew I wanted to do a little bit more. And funny enough, I'm going to be saying that I was looking for a master's program. But when I was graduating college, I didn't want to do a master's. But after some time, I thought, you know what? I think I want to go and do a master's. And I looked for communications programs in particular, because I feel like if you do a master's in meteorology, this is my opinion, and this is kind of like a broader thinking for everything for me. You can know everything there is to know about a certain topic, but if you don't have the tools, the skill set, the foundation to communicate that properly, then your expertise, it's not getting out there the right way. It could be more efficiently done if you knew all the different ways to communicate. You had the proper skill set, the knowledge, the education, the background. So in late 2023, I looked for programs. I applied for the Johns Hopkins program, which is all online, and I got accepted. So knowing this and the 4+ hours of commuting that I was doing each day to get into the city, which adds up a lot of time in the day, I took a step back from Fox Weather to focus on my studies and, more importantly, my health as well, because I don't know about you, but 4+ hours of commuting a day takes a toll on you, not just physically, but mentally as well. So I took a step back to focus on my grad school studies, my health, and here we are now, in 2024, getting this podcast started. So let's talk about why I'm doing the podcast. I really got interested into podcasts in general in 2024 this year, specifically other weather podcasts, particularly Weather Brains with James Spann. Very excellent podcast, and I'm firing these off, recommending them to you, the listener, because these are excellent podcasts, and they've been doing this for quite a while, especially Weather Brains. There are 800+ episodes, and I don't think I would ever get to that point or that level of notoriety in the podcast world or even the weather world. Nobody can top James Spann. Maybe like Dr. Greg Forbes, but James Spann really does a great job with the Weather Brains podcast, and I've started getting into that. I also follow the Stormfront Freaks podcast, a couple of episodes, because it's very fresh. It's a different way of doing a podcast that is not common in the weather podcasting world. Another podcast that I really got heavily into was Across the Sky with a fellow Rutgers alum, Joe Martucci, and his weather team at the time at Lee Enterprises. That podcast has since ended, since the weather team was pretty much disbanded. But I highly recommend checking out what is still available of Across the Sky, because there's still some very good content out there on that. There's also Off the Radar. And I also got into a couple of non-weather related podcasts. The Makeshift podcast is one. And you're probably thinking, why are you mentioning that one? Well, it's a very fun podcast. It's not weather related, but it's very, very fun. They do a lot of games in the podcast episodes, and that has served as some sort of inspiration for me with my podcast, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. But long story short, I got into these podcasts this year a lot, and I thought to myself one day, I think I can do something like that. Maybe there's a space for podcasts to educate people about the weather, explore the world of weather in addition to interviewing people in the industry, and also having some fun along the way. So I thought of the idea of making this podcast that is both conversational, educational, and has some seeds of fun in it as well. And not just conversational with another person that you'd be listening to, but also conversational with you, the listener. I want to be able to talk with you about the weather and share my passion, explore the different realms of the weather. Because, again, it's not just broadcasting. It's not just National Weather Service. There are so many different things that are going on in the weather world. And I want to be able to explore that with you and just have some fun along the way and educate you about the weather as well. Because it really is cool and it does impact us on a day-to-day basis. But anyways, I eventually got the idea. I thought about it for a little while to myself, and finally I asked a couple of people about it because I wanted to see if this was something worthwhile doing. Because I think of a lot of different ideas, but some of them are a little bit half-baked at times. So I wanted to see, like, okay, is this something that you would listen to? Is this something worth pursuing, or is this one of my half-baked ideas? They all thought it was an excellent idea and encouraged me to do it. So after some time, sitting down, planning, brainstorming ideas for different podcast episodes, reaching out to people, thinking about what topics I could talk about, who could I talk to, we're here. This is the first episode of the podcast. I'm finally getting this off the ground and giving it the old college try. Before I get into too much about the details of the release schedule, the structure of the podcast, let's take a quick break right here, and we'll come right back. On this day in weather history, we go back to the St. Elizabeth's flood of November 1421 in northwestern Europe. A powerful extratropical cyclone near the North Sea coast slammed parts of the modern-day Netherlands on November 18th and 19th and brought with it strong winds and heavy rain. The storm caused storm waters to surge up rivers in the Groot-Hollandisch Ward area, or areas of the modern-day Netherlands, causing multiple dikes to overflow and break through. The storm surge completely swallowed a number of villages and caused widespread devastation in Zeeland and Holland, which are part of the coastal region of the Netherlands. The floods caused an estimated 2,000 to 10,000 casualties, and also separated the cities of Hoofdrijdenberg and Dordrecht, which had previously fought each other in a long civil war. Most of the flooded land that separates the two cities remains flooded to this day. These floods would forever be known as the St. Elizabeth's Flood of 1421, getting the name from the feast day of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, which was previously on November 19th. Hey, and welcome back to the Everything Weather Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle David, and we're back on the first episode of the Everything Weather Podcast. So you got a little bit of a taste of what I will be doing with the podcast with the On This Day in Weather History. Every episode will have a new On This Day in Weather where we talk about a particular weather event that happened or a historical event that was impacted by the weather. And on that particular day, the episode is being released or somewhere around there. And exploring all the different historical weather events that have happened as well. That's to kind of just break up the interview so it's not just me and somebody else rambling for the podcast. So getting into a little bit more about what the podcast is going to be all about. As the intro suggested, this is going to be a conversational and educational podcast. We're going to be talking with different weather people about the weather world, exploring the weather, and again, having some fun along the way. Every single Monday, there will be a new episode, but I'll be alternating the format to keep things fresh and interesting. So we're going to be alternating between interview-style episodes and educational solo episodes that I'm going to be calling David's Deep Dives. And I'll explain what that last one is in just a second. But as far as the interviews, I'll be interviewing people in the weather world about what got them interested in the weather, their experiences, what they're currently doing in the weather world, exploring that industry of the weather. There'll also be some discussion, too, on where we think things are going for that area of the weather and in general, and explore that specific area about the weather world. Because, again, it's not just broadcasting, it's not just National Weather Service or government. There's a whole bunch of different things that people are doing out there in the weather world in different areas: financing, communications, government, politics, energy. So we're going to be exploring all these different areas of the weather and these people as well, the people that make it happen. Then we'll also have some fun along the way as well. So each episode is going to have games with it as well. So all of the interview episodes will have games with the guest. We'll have 2 games that we'll plan out together, me and the guest. And then at the end of every single episode, we will have a whether or not trivia where I'll be quizzing them on their weather trivia, their non-weather related trivia, based on what interests them in the weather and also outside of the weather as well. And as I said, this is going to be for every single episode, including David's Deep Dives, and to explore a little bit more about what David's Deep Dives is all about. This is going to be about once or twice a month. There really isn't a structure with this, but I'll let you know, like, hey, I'm going to be doing a David's Deep Dives this week. But just to expect, once or twice a month, we'll be doing solo episodes where I talk about different weather topics. Each episode is going to be a different topic or two, and we'll really get to deep dive into it and learn more about it. Some ideas that I've had and future episodes I'm going to be teasing are historical weather events, some certain topics of the weather, whatever is trending, whatever you, the listener, are interested in, and also my experiences as well, because there may be some people listening to the podcast that want to go to school for meteorology or want to get involved in the weather world, or those that are in the process of doing that, but they want to learn more about what they could do with the weather. So a couple of the David's Deep Dives will be more experience-based discussions and talking about my different experiences, meteorology schools, what it's like to become a meteorologist. Because at the end of the day, I just, if I can help somebody make a decision and help them navigate the weather world, then I'm all for it. And I also want to educate you, the listener, whether you are a weather enthusiast, you have some passing interest of the weather, or you're a weather professional, you're in a broadcast role, you're in government, wherever. There's going to be a little bit of everything for everyone for every single episode. So, and it's also going to be fun along the way too. We're going to have some fun with it as well. Now, if you like the sound of this podcast, please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite listening platform, pretty much everywhere. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, everywhere you get your podcast or music, you're going to find the podcast there. And you can also follow the podcast directly on the feed that we have, and I'll make sure to link that in the show notes for you to follow as well. If you don't have any one of those apps, you can always listen to it directly on our feed. And the best part is it's going to be free forever. We're going to be doing this podcast at no cost to you because I want you to be able to access all there is to know about the weather and have fun, free fun at that. Make sure you also follow eWeather Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, X, or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, Threads, TikTok, and YouTube for even more content. I'll be also teasing some things on there. We'll also have some short form content on the social media platforms as well. And you can, again, follow the page, the podcast directly on the feed. It's going to be a Buzzsprout website. Shout out to Buzzsprout for the awesome service that they have. They create a website for the podcast for me. So, you can follow that all in the show notes for you to follow and go to as well. And with that said, thank you so much for you, the listener, to listening to the podcast. And thank you to all the people that have helped me, have agreed to be on the podcast. And let's have some fun talking about the weather. And I will see you in the next episode.